The morning of the 15th, Sister Anna and I, accompanied by Reverend Mr. Reed and his wife, Miss Jones and Chaplain Gage, visited Brother's grave. Oh, how could we realize, as we stood by that little, narrow, turfless mound, that dear Orville lay there? His poor, heartbroken widow threw herself upon his grave and gave vent to her deep grief in sobs and bitter tears. Nearly 300 brave boys in white lay side by side in that same enclosure, with not even a stone to mark the place where they were sleeping, nor a spear of grass growing upon their graves, simply buried out of sight. But each little mound is cherished, oh, how sacredly, by someone. Julia Susan Wheelock Freeman, October 1862.
The war produced about 1,030,000 casualties, 3% of the population of the country, including 620,000 soldier deaths, 2/3 of which were caused by disease.
The war was an immense human tragedy. I mean, it was on a massive scale, and I think this is one thing that gets lost in 21st century America, is that 22 million people in the North, and more than 300,000 of them die in 4 years. And 9 million people in the South, and close to 250,000 of them die in 4 years. I mean, these are the kind of loss figures that are like the losses in World War I for Europe. I mean, they're huge.
The war accounted for roughly as many American deaths as all American deaths in other U.S. wars combined. Based on an 1860 census figure, 8% of all white males aged 13 to 43 died in the war, including 6% in the North and an extraordinary 18% in the South. One of the reasons for the high number of battle deaths during the war was the use of Napoleonic tactics such as charges. With the advent of more accurate rifled barrels, Minié balls, and near the end of the war, repeating firearms such as the Spencer repeating rifle, soldiers were devastated when standing in lines open to fire. This gave birth to trench warfare, a tactic heavily used during World War I. Those returning home from the war brought with them the problems and experiences of the battlefield. A 2006 survey done by Investigating Civil War Records at the National Archives demonstrated that war trauma can be documented in this country back to the Civil War. At the time, it was called irritable heart, or soldier's heart, and was connected with a lifetime of higher rates of physical and mental disorders in those who had seen combat.
It definitely did occur, but it was something that, I mean, psychology just was not a social science at all. They didn't really know how to diagnose it. I mean, men just sort of go bonkers in their own way, or dealt with it in their own way and said, this is, and it was just very much a society built around manliness, both North and South. And so there was a lot of just sort of keeping it inward, like to be a man is to be quiet and to take it. And so they didn't necessarily express themselves that way. So it's very, very, it definitely happened, but it's just very, very hard to document it, to determine its extent.
The factors that had the most significance were the age of the soldier, the intensity of combat, represented by a percentage of soldiers killed in the company, and finally, a prisoner of war status. Although U.S. Civil War veterans had received pensions since 1862, and Southern state governments had provided their veterans with artificial limbs and veteran retirement homes since the end of the war, it was not until the 1880s and early 1890s that 11 states of the former Confederacy enacted what can accurately be called pension systems. The economic devastation of the war and political upheaval of Reconstruction best explain this long delay. Both the federal government and the southern state governments continued to provide pensions for Civil War veterans and their widows well into the middle of the 20th century. In all, billions of dollars were expended by both sides in an effort to reward the survivors of America's costliest war. By the mid-20th century, both systems were generally considered devoid of their original integrity.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.